This channel creates true crime documentaries, crime analysis, and educational storytelling based on publicly available information, news reports, police documents, and historical records. All content is produced for educational, informational, and documentary purposes only. We do not promote violence, criminal activity, or hate of any kind. Every case is presented with respect to victims, families, and communities affected. The goal of this channel is to inform, raise awareness, and document real events, not to glorify or encourage harmful behavior. All persons mentioned are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Names, dates, and details are based on research, and some information may be incomplete or subject to updates. Viewer discretion is advised due to the nature of true crime content. If you enjoyed true crime stories, gang history, criminal psychology, and real-life cases, please subscribe for more verified and well-researched videos.
Tonight, we take you inside the life of one of the most polarizing men in American criminal history. A man celebrated as a peacemaker, condemned as a killer, and remembered as the founder of one of the most feared street gangs on earth. This is the rise, fall, redemption attempts, and final hours of Stanley "Tookie" Williams. A journey that begins in the broken neighborhoods of Los Angeles and ends behind the walls of San Quentin State Prison, beneath the glow of a single fluorescent light. This is American Gang War TV, and this is the story. Los Angeles, early 1970s. A city already wounded by poverty, discrimination, and the fallout of the Watts riots. But beneath that tension, another storm was brewing. A generation of young men searching for identity, power, and protection in a world that offered them very little. And in that pressure cooker, a new force was born. Its creator? A muscular street legend they would come to call Tookie. Its legacy? The Crips, a movement that would spread from LA to every corner of America and beyond. But the part of the story the world rarely hears is the story of the man behind the myth. The boy who grew up fighting for survival. The man who became a symbol of street power. And the prisoner who became a worldwide icon of redemption, while still being held responsible for 4 brutal murders. Tonight, we follow the entire journey. Tookie Williams entered the world in New Orleans, Louisiana, a city rich with culture but heavy with struggle. His mother, a strong-willed woman, worked constantly to support her family. His father drifted in and out, leaving Tookie with a childhood marked by instability. By the time he was a small boy, Tookie had already learned 2 things. 1, life wouldn't give him anything for free. 2, if you wanted respect, you had to take it. When he was still in elementary school, his family moved west to the tough, changing streets of Los Angeles. A move that would shape the rest of his destiny. As Tookie stepped off the bus into South LA, the neighborhood was already shifting. The factories that once provided work were closing. The streets were tightening with poverty. And the youth, mostly black, mostly poor, were searching for identity in a city that dismissed them. LA was a divided world. On one side, Hollywood glamour. On the other, neighborhoods forgotten by the system. Tookie grew up in that forgotten zone. He wasn't big yet, but he was fearless. A kid who refused to back down, even when the odds were impossible. That fearlessness earned him both respect and danger. By his teens, Tookie's body transformed. Powerful muscles, massive shoulders, hands that looked like they were carved from stone. He became impossible to ignore. And in the streets of South Central, being impossible to ignore can be a blessing or a curse. Tookie was constantly challenged. Older boys tried him. Grown men tried him. Fighters from other neighborhoods tried him. And each time, he held his own. Word spread. There's this kid named Tookie, and he ain't scared of nobody. But Tookie didn't just want to fight. He wanted power. He wanted control over his environment. And in that desire, he found another young street legend rising at the same time. A kid named Raymond Washington. Their paths were about to collide, and when they did, Los Angeles would never be the same. In the early 1970s, Raymond Washington was building a reputation of his own. He was younger, charismatic, and moved through the neighborhoods with a confidence that made people pay attention. When Tookie and Raymond finally met, it was like two magnets snapping together. Different personalities, same extreme ambition. They shared a vision. A group of young black men who would stick together, defend their neighborhoods, and command respect in the city. And from that shared vision, the Crips were born. At first, it wasn't the massive gang empire the world knows today. It was small, local, almost like a neighborhood brotherhood. But something happened that neither Raymond nor Tookie planned. The Crips spread, and spread fast. Kids saw the blue colors, the confidence, the unity, and they wanted in. From one neighborhood to another, side streets to alleys, projects to blocks, the Crips became a movement. And with more members came more violence. The city changed. The streets changed. Tookie changed. He was no longer just a fighter. He was a symbol, a leader, an enforcer. But symbols come with consequences. This is American Gang War TV. And this is the rise of a legend who never asked to be a legend. By the early 1970s, South Central Los Angeles was undergoing a transformation, one that no politician, no pastor, and no peace organization could stop. What began as a neighborhood force, the West Side Crips, was spreading like a storm cloud across the city. Tookie wasn't just a participant. He was an architect. Not the only architect, but one of the loudest, strongest, and most feared. Police reports from the era described him as physically intimidating, highly influential, and dangerously charismatic. Between the ages of 15 and 19, Tookie went from a street kid to a shot caller to a citywide name. No social media, no smartphones, just reputation. And his reputation echoed. Older gang members, some in their late 20s and 30s, watched Tookie operate and knew he was different. He wasn't just strong. He wasn't just fearless. He understood people. He understood what anger could do, what loyalty could create, and what fear could control. And under him and Raymond Washington, the gang's culture evolved. Blue bandanas, street taxation, retaliation cycles, neighborhood alliances. And the idea that a Crip didn't just represent a block. He represented a movement. Tookie didn't invent every concept, but he helped popularize the Crip identity at a scale Los Angeles had never seen. Decades later, gang historians still point to this era, 1972, 1973, 1974, as the period when the Crips transformed from a handful of neighborhoods into a citywide force. With growth came conflict. The neighborhoods that resisted Crip expansion banded together. Some had been rivals. Some had been neutral. But they all shared one thing. They refused to wear blue. And from that resistance, a new coalition formed. The Bloods. Tookie would later deny ever targeting people for wearing red. And maybe he didn't, personally. But the streets had already evolved past individual control. What began as neighborhood friction turned into citywide polarization. Blue versus red, Crip versus blood. Retaliation, response, retaliation, response. No breaks, no peace. And as violence increased, the police turned their attention toward one of the names they heard most often: Stanley "Tookie" Williams. By 1974, officers couldn't enter South Central without hearing one of two things: Crips are coming. Tookie's around. Whether true or not didn't matter. The name itself carried a gravitational force. Parents whispered it to each other. Youth bragged about it. Local newspapers started documenting it. Detectives took an interest in it. And as a result, anything that happened near the Crips, anything rumored in the streets, anything unsolved, the name Tookie floated to the surface. Some accusations were exaggerated. Some were fabricated by rivals. Some were tied to the gang, not him personally. And some, investigators believed, were real. But perception became reality. When you're the most feared man in a rising gang, every street rumor becomes your cross to carry. Los Angeles in the mid-70s was boiling. Unemployment was high. Police-community relations were at a breaking point. Neighborhoods were fragmented. Drugs were creeping in. Firearms were easier to obtain. And in the middle of this chaos, the Crips grew faster than anyone could document. Tookie later claimed he never intended for the gang to take on the level of violence it did. He said what they started was about brotherhood and protection, not destruction. But the streets don't listen to intentions. They only listen to momentum. And by then, the Crips were moving at full speed. By 1979, Tookie was 25 years old, a towering figure, physically, emotionally, culturally. But the same city that once feared him was now hunting him. Detectives connected him to a series of robberies that ended in multiple deaths. Tookie insisted the accusations were false, that he was being framed because of his reputation, his size, his history, and his status as the co-founder of a gang the city now saw as an existential threat. But in the court of public opinion, the verdict had already been decided. Before a trial, before testimony, before evidence, the name Tookie Williams filled the newspapers. And when he was finally arrested, police treated it as the capture of a kingpin. This wasn't the fall of just another criminal. This was the removal of a street icon. The trial was intense, emotionally charged, media-driven. A symbol of Los Angeles's war on gangs. Prosecutors painted Tookie as a ruthless criminal. Defense attorneys argued there was no physical evidence connecting him to the killings. Witness testimony was questioned. Ballistics were disputed. Motive was unclear. But trials don't happen in a vacuum. They happen in a world shaped by fear, politics, and public pressure. And in that world, Tookie's past, his leadership, his reputation, his name, hung over the courtroom like a shadow. It influenced jurors. It influenced headlines. It influenced everything. At the end of a high-profile legal battle, the verdict came down. Guilty. And with it, a death sentence. Stanley "Tookie" Williams, once a teenager lifting weights in Venice Beach, was now one of the most infamous inmates on California's death row. His story didn't end in that courtroom. In many ways, it was only beginning. The next chapter would redefine him, not as a gang founder, not as a street legend, but as something no one expected. A reformer, a writer, a teacher, a man who would try to undo the damage of his early life. But redemption is never simple. And Los Angeles never forgets. Stanley "Tookie" Williams arrived at San Quentin State Prison not as another inmate, but as a name that echoed across every tier, every yard, every cell block. His reputation walked in before he did. To correctional officers, he was a high-risk figure, a symbol of Los Angeles gang violence. To inmates, he was a legend, someone whose street identity had reached myth-level status. And the prison system had one response for men considered this dangerous: immediate isolation. San Quentin placed him in a heavily secured unit, a world of steel doors, echoing hallways and round-the-clock surveillance. But this isolation would become the birthplace of change. True crime historians call the 1980s one of the bloodiest periods inside California's prisons. Racial tension, gang rivalries, drug economies, power struggles, retaliation cycles that stretched from the streets to the cell blocks. San Quentin was not just a prison, it was the battlefield. And inside this environment, Tookie Williams faced a choice: continue the path that brought him there, or reinvent himself entirely. The world expected him to embrace violence, to lead, to recruit, to dominate. But instead, Tookie did something no one predicted. He stopped. He rejected gang life, rejected the identity he helped build, rejected the violence, the power, and the reputation. And in the most unlikely of places, on death row, he began a transformation. Tookie later described a moment, quiet, unremarkable, but life-altering, when he looked into a stainless steel mirror inside his cell and didn't see a gang founder. He saw responsibility. He saw the consequences of influence. He saw a generation of young men following a path he helped shape. He realized something chilling. The Crip organization had become too large for any one man to control. It had mutated, evolved, and spread across states. And he felt accountable, not legally, but morally. This was the spark that launched the next chapter of his life. A chapter that shocked prison officials, community leaders, and even rival gangs. From deep inside a cell on California's death row, Tookie Williams started to write. Not memoirs, not gang stories. He wrote children's books, messages warning kids about the very life he once lived. Simple words, direct messages, hard truths. Titles like Life in Prison and the Tookie Speaks Out series became tools for youth outreach, and schools began using his writing. Teachers brought his books into classrooms. Parents read them at night. Community centers shared them during intervention programs. Suddenly, the man once known for influencing gang culture was influencing young people in a completely different way. This shift caught everyone's attention, including academics, activists, and international peace organizations. The prison transformation of Tookie Williams became a topic of global interest. Journalists interviewed him. Criminologists studied him. Celebrities spoke about him. Youth groups invited him virtually to talk to kids. He wasn't preaching innocence. He wasn't begging for sympathy. He was pushing prevention, anti-violence, anti-gang, anti-retaliation. The man who once symbolized Los Angeles's gang era was now advocating for its end. And soon, the world began taking notice in a major way. Between 2001 and 2005, something extraordinary happened. Something unheard of for a man on death row. Tookie Williams was nominated multiple times for the Nobel Peace Prize, both in peace and literature categories. The nominations didn't mean he was guaranteed to win, but the symbolism was powerful. A man condemned for violent crimes was being recognized for global anti-violence work. This became one of the most controversial debates in California's political landscape. Some praised him as a reformed man trying to save lives. Others dismissed it as manipulation or a strategy to avoid execution. The public became divided. Politicians became divided. Even rival gangs debated whether his efforts were genuine or performative. But the impact was undeniable. Kids were reading his books. Teachers were hearing from their students. Communities were discussing alternatives to gang life. From a solitary cell, his message echoed across the world. Yet despite the documentaries, the books, the outreach, and the peace efforts, California's justice system did not slow down. The appeals continued. The legal filings grew. The deadlines approached. To the state, this was still a capital case, a case tied to multiple lives lost, families seeking closure, and a jury verdict that had been upheld for decades. And as his execution date neared, a national spotlight fell once again on the name Tookie Williams. This time, the focus was not on gang violence, but on redemption. Had he changed? Was it real? Was transformation possible for someone with his past? These questions split the country in two. By late 2005, the appeals had run out. The petitions had been filed. The public campaigns had been launched. Celebrities, activists, and scholars urged California's governor to grant clemency. Supporters argued that executing Tookie would destroy one of the most powerful anti-gang voices to ever come from the streets. Opponents argued that remorse didn't erase the past, that lives lost could not be restored, and that the legal system had spoken. And so, in December 2005, the state made its decision. A decision that would end a chapter, ignite protests, and forever cement Tookie Williams in American criminal justice history. December 2005, San Quentin State Prison. A name once whispered on the streets of Los Angeles was now printed in newspapers, broadcast on national television, and debated in universities around the world. Stanley Tookie Williams had reached the final stage of a decades-long legal journey. Whether people viewed him as a redeemed man or a dangerous criminal, the clock was ticking, and the world was watching. In the final weeks leading up to his scheduled execution, an intense legal and political battle erupted. Attorneys filed last-minute appeals. Activists organized demonstrations outside the prison gates. Celebrities made public statements. Professors, clergy, and youth counselors submitted letters of support. Their message was straightforward. Even if Tookie Williams could not undo the past, his transformation was real. His anti-gang influence was saving lives. Executing him would silence a voice that reached young people in ways few adults could. But the opposition was equally passionate. District attorneys, law enforcement unions, victims' family members, political leaders. They argued that the courts had upheld the conviction for 24 years, that the justice system had been given every chance to reconsider, that the facts of the case stood, and that the families of the victims deserved closure. The governor's office became the final battlefield, a place where morality, politics, rehabilitation, and punishment all collided. On December 12, 2005, after reviewing thousands of pages of records, petitions, and public comments, California's governor issued his decision. Clemency denied. The announcement shook the country. For some, it was justice. For others, it was a devastating blow to the idea of rehabilitation. In the hours that followed, the debate only intensified. Supporters argued that his execution would send a chilling message, that even dramatic personal transformation meant nothing, that redemption was irrelevant, that people who tried to change would not be given the chance to make an impact. Opponents countered that accountability mattered, that a death sentence carried consequences, and that moral transformation could not erase the legal reality of the crime. The lines were drawn, the emotions were raw, and the clock kept moving forward. San Quentin prepared for one of the most high-profile executions in modern American history. Correctional officers implemented strict protocols. Media crews lined up outside the prison gates. Protesters gathered carrying candles, signs, and banners with Tookie's name. Inside the prison, Tookie Williams remained calm. Witnesses later described him as composed, reflective, and accepting. He had spent more than 2 decades in isolation. He had written books, counseled youth, and spoken out against the very gang culture he once helped build. Now, in the final hours of his life, he faced a reality he could not escape. He met with spiritual advisors, spoke with supporters, wrote final messages. He maintained one position until the end. He said the crimes attributed to him were not his doing, but he fully accepted responsibility for the destructive legacy of the Crips. It was a complex, painful truth, one that many struggled to reconcile. On December 13th, just after midnight, correctional officers escorted Tookie Williams from his cell to the execution chamber. San Quentin's execution room, cold, sterile, lit with harsh fluorescent lights, was the final stop in a life filled with both destruction and redemption. Witnesses sat behind glass panels. Reporters took notes. Family members of victims watched with solemn focus. The room was silent, except for the sounds of movement, metal clinks, quiet footsteps, and the soft hum of machinery. This was the moment where decades of debate, pain, violence, transformation, and controversy all converged. As preparations were made, Tookie maintained his composure. He offered no final words, no anger, no defiance, only stillness. At 12:35 a.m., the procedure began. Minutes passed. Witnesses watched quietly. Journalists recorded every detail. At 12:36 a.m., the official announcement came. Stanley Tookie Williams was pronounced dead, the man who co-founded one of America's most notorious street gangs, the man whose life had inspired fear, debate, anger, admiration, and controversy, was gone. But his story was far from over. News of his death spread across the world within minutes. Outside the prison, hundreds of supporters held candles and embraced. Some cried, some prayed, some stood in silence. Critics reacted differently. They believed justice had been served, that the legal process had spoken loud and clear. But regardless of opinion, everyone understood one thing. The chapter in American gang history had officially closed. In the years that followed, the debate around Tookie Williams only intensified. Was he a dangerous man who masked his past with reform, or a reformed man whose past overshadowed his redemption? Teachers continued using his books. Youth counselors played recordings of his speeches. Anti-gang programs referenced his transformation as a lesson in choices and consequences. Even rival gang members, men from neighborhoods divided by color and turf, acknowledged that his message carried weight. The legacy of Stanley "Tookie" Williams became twofold: a cautionary tale of how one life can ignite widespread violence, and a powerful example of how one life can also inspire change. His story was complicated, painful, uncomfortable, human. It was the story of an era, a city, a movement, a man who shaped history in ways even he never expected. When a figure as controversial as Stanley "Tookie" Williams leaves this world, the impact doesn't fade overnight. It echoes, it divides, it forces a country to confront uncomfortable truths about crime, redemption, justice, and consequences. The hours after his passing marked the beginning of a new phase in his story. A phase not written in courtroom transcripts or prison logs, but in conversations, communities, and cultural shifts that still linger today. In the days following his execution, news outlets across the United States devoted major coverage to the story. Some headlines focused on the crimes, others focused on the transformation, but nearly all recognized the magnitude of the moment. A gang co-founder, internationally known author, and Nobel Peace Prize nominee had been executed by the state of California. Debates erupted on talk shows, in classrooms, in churches, and in political arenas. Journalists interviewed prison officials, criminologists, childhood friends, and former gang members. Every voice added a different angle, every perspective shaped by pain, experience, or memory. For many, Tookie's death marked the end of a long and emotional chapter. For others, it raised questions about redemption and the purpose of punishment. The story refused to fade. It demanded attention. In South Central Los Angeles, the birthplace of the Crips, the reaction was complex. Older community members remembered the early days of gang emergence, the fear, the fights, the turf wars, the funerals. Some believed Tookie's execution represented closure. Others saw it as a loss of a man who had tried to undo the very world he helped create. Younger members, many of them disconnected from the era when Tookie walked the streets, felt his death differently. Some had grown up reading his anti-gang books. Some had heard counselors quote him during intervention programs. Some had watched documentaries that showed him speaking passionately about change. To them, he wasn't the man from the 1970s. He was the voice telling them not to join the life. In certain neighborhoods, murals appeared, not glorifying gang life, but honoring the message of transformation. In others, conversations about accountability and responsibility resurfaced. Difficult, raw conversations that communities had avoided for decades. Inside gang culture, reactions were divided. Some Crip sets respected Tookie's efforts to stop the violence. They saw his transformation as a sign that the lifestyle wasn't worth the consequences. Other sets, however, viewed his anti-gang stance as betrayal, a rejection of the organization he helped build. But one truth remained. The Crips' identity, structure, and culture had evolved far beyond the control of any single individual, including its founders. By 2005, the gang had spread across multiple states, multiple cities, and even multiple countries. Its trajectory, whether destructive or redemptive, was no longer tied to one man. Still, Tookie's name carried weight. Some younger members looked at his fate and saw a warning. Others saw a legend whose life had come full circle. But all recognized that his story, however complicated, would remain part of the gang's history forever. Sociologists, criminologists, and historians began studying Tookie's life in depth. Not the street myths, not the exaggerated rumors, but the documented truth. How a teenager with no formal power or resources helped shape one of the most influential gang networks in American history. How poverty, segregation, systemic neglect, and community fractures contributed to gang formation. How retaliation culture escalated violence across Los Angeles. How gang identity grew stronger than individual control. And equally significant, how a man responsible for creating a violent organization attempted to dismantle the mentality that fueled it. Universities used his life as a case study in criminology, prison reform, youth intervention, gang sociology, leadership influence, redemption theory, punishment philosophy. His writings appeared in academic discussions alongside research on deterrence, rehabilitation, and recidivism. The contradictions in his life, violent past versus nonviolent reform, made him one of the most analyzed criminal figures in modern history. International audiences were equally captivated. In Europe, activists held memorial events. In Africa, community leaders discussed his anti-gang message in youth programs. In Asia and South America, newspapers published editorials about forgiveness, justice, and the possibility of change. Tookie Williams had become more than a Los Angeles story. He had become a global symbol, a warning, and a lesson. Some saw him as proof that transformation is possible. Others saw him as proof that consequences are permanent. But either way, the world was talking. No true crime story is complete without acknowledging the families whose lives were forever changed. For them, the pain never faded. The loved ones lost in the original case remained the center of their world. Not the political debate, not the international tension, not the media frenzy. Their grief was personal. Their memories were sacred. Some family members expressed relief at the finality of the process. Others continued to struggle with the complicated emotions surrounding Tookie's transformation. But for all of them, the loss was permanent. And true crime storytelling demands we acknowledge the truth, because every criminal case, no matter how public or controversial, begins with victims whose voices must never be forgotten. Stanley "Tookie" Williams left behind a legacy unlike any other figure in American gang history. A founder of a notorious organization, a symbol of urban violence, a name feared across the streets of Los Angeles. And yet, a man who later dedicated his life to stopping the very path he once walked. His story challenges easy conclusions. It forces hard questions about justice, change, accountability, and humanity. In schools, his books still reach young readers. In prisons, his transformation is studied by men seeking their own redemption. In communities across America, his warnings echo as reminders of how far and how fast street life can escalate. His story is not clean, not simple, not comfortable. It is real. It is layered. It is American. It is tragic. It is transformative. And it is far from forgotten.